I love a scrappy quilt and I love a bear claw quilt. So when I made this scrappy bear claw quilt and recorded the whole thing and then found out that I had recorded no audio for the whole tutorial, I was pretty sad. And I did finish the quilt, but it kind of went on the back burner for quite a while. But it is time to dig it back up. I'm going to make an 18-inch version of this block for a pillow front. And there are 2 downloads for this week. There is the original big block, full quilt, all the cutting instructions for a large 68 by 68 quilt, and there is also the instructions to make the pillow front version, which is 4 blocks plus some sashing around the outside, and that will measure 18 by 18. So all the blocks have been downsized a little bit, but should be a really adorable pillow. The quilt version I sized to make the best use of 5-inch square scraps. So if you have a charm pack collection sitting around, this would be a great opportunity to make a quilt out of it. So I love how this block looks in a scrappy kind of layout, but you do have other options. If you would like to use fewer colors, then you are absolutely able to do that. You can cut all of these pieces from fat quarters, but my suggestion would be that there are 2 sizes of squares to cut from a fat quarter or a larger piece of fabric. And I would try to cut both of these sizes from each of those fat quarters so that you get a kind of even distribution of prints. If you take a look at the diagram, the larger squares will end up being the claws and the smaller squares will end up being the paw area. So you want to have fabrics that are in both the paw and the claw. So you need to cut both sizes, whether you're making the blanket or the pillow, from those fabrics so that you don't have all claw fabrics and all paw fabrics. If you would like to do the variation of the bear claw where the center of the paw is one large square, then you can absolutely do that. For the pillow version, you would need a 5.5-inch square to replace these 4 smaller squares. And on the blanket side, this kind of paw area would be 8.5 inches. Let me just double check on my little notes here. Quilter's choice, you can do whichever one you would prefer. I love the mix of lots of fabrics, so I'm gonna go with the tiny squares. I've already cut all of my fabrics, and you can set aside these kind of longer triangles. Triangles. This is not a triangle. This is a rectangle. You can set aside these larger rectangles of your background fabric for now. We won't need those until we're ready to assemble the entire block. Likewise with these small squares of your print and your background. We're going to be first dealing with the larger squares and of the print and the background. And we're going to be making half square triangles with all of these squares. Now, I want to talk just a little bit about alternative methods of making half square triangles. There are as many as you can count. I did a whole video on them, and in the comments to that video, there's actually a ton more techniques that I had just not even thought of. The main reason I have chosen to do 2 at a time half square triangles in this case is just so I have a variety of half square triangle kind of fabric combinations. If I was going to make 8 at a time half square triangles with these 2 fabrics, then I would have 8 half square triangles that combined only these 2 prints. So if I was making a block, then half of my half square triangles would be the same fabric combination. So every other claw would be this fabric with this fabric. If I mix it up a little bit and do 2 at a time, then I'm going to end up with just more variety. I might have 2 of this combination and 2 of this combination. It just allows you to mix it up a little bit more and have more prints and more variety in your blocks. There's nothing wrong with doing 8 at a time. If you want to use fewer fabrics, then that might be a great way for you to go in the quilt version. And if you want some help with the math on that, I do have a whole video on that. I will link it below on different methods to make half square triangles. Today, I'm just going to stick with 2 at a time. And I actually bought a couple of little tools to help us with half square triangles. Someone suggested this to me in the comments on one of the videos for marking the diagonal lines for making 2 at a time half square triangles. So this little tool is from Fons and Porter. And you need it and a pen. And you place this kind of main yellow diagonal line on the diagonal of your block, and then you are able to mark kind of your sewing lines rather than having the one diagonal line and then sewing 1/4 of an inch on either side. This now gives me sewing lines. So maybe it'll improve my accuracy. There is a little bit of trimming room built into my cutting instructions because I always want to trim my half square triangles down. But if you go for a more exact kind of cutting template for your half square triangles, then maybe this tool will help you. So I'll put a link to this down below. I'm gonna go ahead and mark all of my white background squares here, and then we'll be ready to go to the next step of the half square triangles. So I am marking my last background square with this little tool, and I just wanted to point out one thing that I have noticed that is kind of annoying about this tool is that the labels here, this Fons and Porter and the OmniGrid, do take up a chunk of where that yellow line is. I felt like every time I went to set it down to mark a diagonal, I was laying it right where that label was, and then I would have to shift it so that both of my kind of corners of my square were on that yellow line. So is it a big deal? Not really, but I feel like they could have put a little bit more thought and maybe had that yellow dash line here and then the logo smaller on one side, or I don't know, figure out some kind of better way so that this is kind of prime real estate for this ruler, and it was kind of frustrating. But we'll see if it improves my accuracy. Now, I marked my background squares just because they were the lighter fabric. If I was doing like white bear claws on a black background, then I would probably mark the white fabric over here and leave the background fabric alone. It's just because this was the lightest fabric, so my pen shows up the best. Now that these are all marked, I am going to place them all right side together with my scrappy prints, and then I will be sewing on the line this time. Usually I'm always sew 1/4 of an inch away, and the instructions for the both downloads actually do have you mark that center diagonal and sew on either side. But we'll see if this little tool helps me. I'm just going to pair all these and then we'll be sewing. I have sewn on the lines, which feels very strange, but from here on out it is assembly just like 2 at a time half square triangles. I'm going to cut on the diagonal, which is between the lines, and now we have our 2 half square triangles. In the comments of one video after I made a bunch of half square triangles, many of you suggested this trimming tool where you could trim your half square triangles before you press them open. And on this one, on the larger sizes here, there's even slots for you to trim off those little dog ears. Now this came as a set of 2, and one of these does kind of the 1/2 inch sizes, so like 3.5, 4.5, 5.5, and then the other one does the even number 2 inch, 3 inch, 4 inch size half square triangles. So you can buy them separately. I got mine on Amazon. I will put a link in the description below, but make sure you're buying the correct one because there are both the unfinished and finished sizes on this. So the bold print numbers on this ruler, which are 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, are the raw size of block that you want to make. And then there is a small print like 1 inch finished, 2 inch, 3 inch. So just make sure you're buying the right one if you don't buy the set and only buy one. Now, one of my concerns with using a tool like this is that usually when I make a half square triangle block, I open it up, I press it, and then I trim it. Here, because I am trimming it before I'm going to press it, I'm concerned that pressing it is going to distort that nice, perfect square shape. So I have 2 half square triangles here. They are identical. They were made together. And I have pressed one as I normally do, and I'm going to trim it in kind of my old style. And this other one here, I haven't pressed open yet, and I'm going to trim it with this tool and see if it ends up perfectly square. Now I did mark the sewing line with that purple pen, and it is kind of nice to have that because I can use that purple line to line up this ruler instead of the stitching line, which isn't always super visible, especially if you're using like white thread on a white fabric here. So I have that lined up here, and I'm going to trim both of these sides and get rid of all this little trimmy stuff. Now the slots to trim off the dog ears only start kind of the larger size blocks here, so I am gonna have some little dog ears. If I had scissors I could trim them off, if not, but I do have a rotary cutter, so I'm just gonna trim those off. Now I'm gonna press this. Okay, looks pretty good. I didn't do a very good job trimming those dog ears off, so I'll have to snip them off with scissors when I can find my pair of scissors. But it looks pretty square. Let's see. And it's pretty square. I think that my ruler did slip a little bit when I was cutting, so I am just a little bit shy of 2.5 inches, but it doesn't seem like me pressing it distorted the shape at all. Now this is a small block. I might get more distortion on a big block, but trying this does make me feel better about using this tool and pressing afterwards, because pressing was my concern. So my old way of trimming was to press my block, put my ruler down, and line up that diagonal with the diagonal seam. And I want to make sure that my 2.5 inch line here has some fabric overhang, so I can trim these two sides and then rotate this block around, and now I can perfectly line up that edge with the 2.5 and trim. If you have a tiny rotating cutting mat, then I definitely recommend it. I have several. I have a large rotating cutting mat that's, I think it's like 14 or 16 inches. And then I also have this small version, which is great for small blocks. I'm gonna go ahead and finish the rest of these half square triangles, get them all trimmed and pressed, and then we'll be ready to make our blocks. I have finished trimming all of my half square triangles, and I did about half kind of my traditional way and half with that trim tool, and they look pretty much interchangeable. The trim tool does save some time since you're only trimming 2 sides of the square, and you're getting all 4 sides trimmed. So if you are into time saving, then that might be the tool for you. I will say that it was a little large and awkward to use for this size of half square triangles. I might look around and see if it comes in kind of like a smaller size for these small blocks. I do tend to make mostly smaller size half square triangles, so I would love one that just kind of went up to like 4.5 or 5 inches. And yeah, interesting buy. If you have the chance to try one out, if someone in your guild has one or something, then it might be worth investigating. Now, as far as this little tool went that allows you to mark the sewing lines on your half square triangles instead of marking the diagonal and then sewing that seam allowance on either side, I think that this is just another personal preference thing. When I sew half square triangles, I usually mark that center line, and then I usually do a pretty skimpy seam allowance there so that I have a little bit more trimming room when I'm trimming down my half square triangles, because I'm not as concerned about what's in the seam allowance as I am about the size of the finished block. Now, this ruler, you could certainly mark either side and then sew a little bit inside, but this might be perfect for you if you like that line to sew on. For me, I'll probably just mark the diagonal line and sew on either side, but I'm glad that I tried this so that I could see if I got better results. So it was worth a couple bucks to investigate. And I'll keep it around or pass it along to someone who wants to try this method as well. So now it's time to assemble our little 9-patch claw units. And we're gonna need those 2.5 inch print squares that we set aside in the first step, and all of our half square triangles. You will be making 4 of these blocks, so you can kind of stack them up and chain piece them. I'm just gonna show you one here. And for that one, we're gonna need 4 of our 2.5 inch squares, and I'm just kind of skipping around here to get a good variety. And we will also need 4 of our little half square triangle claw bits. And we're just going to place those like this. I want to get a good mix. The half square triangles should all point with the print kind of towards the center. You want to make sure that you don't have it like this, where the tip of this print triangle is pointing away from the middle of the block. Then your little claws won't look quite as much like claws. In this upper corner, we're going to grab one of our 2.5 inch square background pieces. And that is our quarter claw block. I'm going to assemble this as I would any 9 patch and then make the other 3. And then we will be able to assemble our little pillow front, and then we can start talking about quilting options. I have been sewing away and I have our bear claw quarters here all assembled. And I did take a moment to lay these blocks down and just measure them. I have my 6.5 inch ruler here, and I did need to trim down a few of these edges. I had some of these blocks were kind of sticking out a little bit, and I want to make sure that the next step of assembly goes pretty smoothly, especially when you're working with scraps. Some of these 2.5 inch squares were charm pack squares that I cut in half. And they clearly, in retrospect, were not perfectly 5 inches, because like this one was stuck out about almost 1/4 inch, so I trimmed that down. Other ones were a little short or stuck out in different areas, so I just took a moment and squared them up as closely as I could with a ruler. So they're not perfect. When you're working with really small blocks like this, the margin for error is a lot smaller. So if your seam allowance is off just a thread width, in a big block, you can kind of compensate for that. But there's so many seams here that that thread width really adds up. So they're not perfect, but I'm happy with them. I think they're cute. And now it's time to assemble our big 18 inch pillow front block. So the diagram here is right in the pattern. You will need all of the bear claw quarters, the rest of your 2.5 inch white squares, the rectangles that we set aside at the beginning, and the final 2.5 inch square print block. So we start with our bear claw quarters. And you will have these so that all the half square triangles are around the outside of the block. And that final little print goes right in the middle. And then we're just going to fill in with all these rectangles, and then we can start sewing. I did repeat a lot of the same background print, this little kind of clovery look print. So if I was doing this and wanted the background to be all the same print, then I probably would have combined some of these long strips into one instead of sewing these seams. But I've cut these according to the instructions, which assumes that you're using lots of different prints. So I will have these seams to sew where I'm sewing the same fabric to itself, but it'll all work out. So now it's time to sew this all together. And there are a couple different strategies you could take here. However it makes sense to you to make this all come together. Since I had all of my pieces for this block already laid out for the camera, I went ahead and assembled it as I would any kind of 9 or 16 patch block by working down that first vertical seam, kind of creating pairs of units, and then laying it back out. I pressed as I went, and then I added that third column of units. And I progressed across the block, creating rows of all of the units, and then I sewed the rows together. So that last seam was kind of that middle seam right across the block. I went ahead and pressed my blocks in whatever direction seemed best for reducing bulk. So most of the bulk of the bear claw blocks is pressed towards the background fabrics. And I did press towards that one little center print patch so that I could nest those seams. So my pillow front is done. The assembly for the quilt is very similar, except you will be doing a little bit of pre-assembly. Whereas in the pillow, we only kind of pre-assembled these little bear claw quarter units. In the quilt, you actually make the full kind of block and then assemble the quilt from there. So it's slightly different, but very similar, and it just makes the quilt assembly go a little bit more smoothly when you have kind of bigger components to work with. I'm going to take my pillow front and make a little quilt sandwich out of it, and then when we come back, we will be free motion quilting this bear claw pillow front. I decided to use kind of a wavy line, kind of toothpastey motif on this pillow front so that it would have some really great texture. And I know that you can't see the actual quilting on the pillow front very well, so I did add this little drawing here off to the side. To quilt this design, you begin with a simple wavy line. Mine is maybe 3 inches long, and echo it on both sides to kind of fatten it up and make it look a little bit more like a toothpaste swirl. Once you're happy with it, then you simply start again with a new wavy line, echoing it, and then finishing it up and adding another one. Where this design gets interesting is when you connect several of the points together, you're left with kind of these interesting spaces in the middle to fill. And to fill them, you just add echoes to one of the curved lines, and it creates this really interesting kind of texture and shape where some of the wavy lines look like they're kind of stretched and kind of tucking under and over each other. And you can get around this design pretty easily by just adding more echoes. I continued using this method of drawing wavy lines, connecting the points, and then filling in the little spaces in between to work my way around this quilt. You can see I added an extra echo around a previously quilted toothpaste swirl just so I could get to a new area. So this is a very beginner-friendly design. It's very easy to do on a regular sewing machine because you're spending a lot of time in kind of one area. So you can pretty much fully quilt the space between your hands before having to move on. There's not a lot of jumping around and kind of going back to going back to old areas or having to deal with new areas before you're complete. My pillow is all quilted and turned into a pillowcase, and I love this mix of aqua with the white. It's so cheerful, and I used an aqua zipper, and the back of the pillow I just quilted with straight lines, and this fabric is actually the leftover backing from the full quilt size. So I loved being able to use up that last little bit. I thought that the quilting on this pillow was really fun and textural, and I'm really excited to see how it washes up. I think it's gonna really kind of crinkle around all those lines of quilting and give some really nice kind of cuddly texture. The quilt version, I actually ended up quilting with a pantograph from Urban Elements that is junk food. The quilt was meant for my son, and so it has pizza and ice cream and kind of all of his favorite things on it. And he loves it. It's already on his bed, so it's been adopted into the family. So again, you can find the downloads for both the pillow size and the full quilt size on my website. There is a link in the description below this video. You might have to click on see more or pop down a window depending on what platform you're on, or you can always go to tinyorchardquilts.com and all of my free patterns are there. You just have to go through a really short checkout process to be able to download them, but they are all free. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I will be back in a couple weeks with another video for you. In the meantime, there are videos popping up on the screen that you may love. And I will see you guys soon. Happy quilting!